Today's project, we're going to show you guys how to replace a CV axle on a front wheel drive vehicle. This happens to be a 2015 Buick Lacrosse. However, this process is the same for various other GM vehicles. There's some necessary tools that you're going to need. We'll walk through the necessary tools on each individual step to show you guys how easily you can do this yourself at home. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we need to jack up the vehicle and get a good quality jack stand under there as well. I usually keep both of those underneath the vehicle at the same time. Also, if you don't have an impact to take off your lug nuts, go ahead and loosen those up before you jack it up. It'll make it easier for you to get that off by yourself. Then go ahead and take off your lug nuts. So this is the part that we're going to be replacing here, and as you can see there, the boot is tore. So what happens typically is the grease just comes out of there and it makes the joint fail prematurely. Next, we're going to be loosening up this axle nut. Now if you have an impact, you don't necessarily need to do it now, but especially if you don't have an impact, you're going to want to do this while you still have this rotor on here. And what you can do is take a screwdriver, you can stick it down in there, and that will help you get some leverage. So if you have a breaker bar, you can manually get that off. In my case here, I'm just going to be using my impact, and it is a 32mm on here. If you don't have one of these, you can always go to your local parts store and they'll rent these axle nut sockets out for you for free. Alright, so now you got that loosened up. Now that'll be easier to remove when you get to that step here in a little bit. Next, we're going to be taking off the caliper here. Now it is possible to take the caliper, the rotor, and everything off at one piece and set it aside. However, if you disconnect this brake line here, you're going to have to bleed the brakes. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the caliper off. We're going to use our caliper hanger here, and we're going to hang it up here and get that out of the way. Then we'll remove the rotor and this bracket and put those off to the side. Next, we're going to compress this a little bit. Sometimes you have to compress the caliper to get this off. Anytime when you're compressing the caliper, it's usually best to loosen up your brake reservoir up there, because what that'll do is if you put too much pressure on there, you could potentially blow out a seal. So loosen that up, then get your C-clamp, and we're simply going to apply a little pressure on this brake pad just to free this up. Now sometimes they'll just come off, but a lot of times this is necessary to get this loosened up. And you don't have to get wild with compressing that. Just do it a little bit until it gets loosened up like that. Then simply pull off your caliper. You're going to take your hanger here and you're going to hang it up here on the strut like that, so it's out of the way. Next, we're going to be removing the caliper bracket bolts, and there's two of them back here, and that's just going to be a 21mm. On the previous step for our caliper bolts, these were all 14mm. So we'll go ahead and remove these. Go ahead and take the bracket off. Next, we want to remove this rotor screw. To do that, you're going to need a T30 bit. And just come in here and be very careful that you don't strip this out, and just loosen that up. Then when you remove that, then your rotor should just pop right off. Now we want to take another jack and put it underneath your control arm. So as we start loosening up some of this stuff, this will help support the control arm so it does not fall. So go ahead and jack it up underneath the control arm. And that doesn't have to be real tight. That's just there for extra support. Now we're going to be loosening up this tie rod. To do this, you need an 18mm open end wrench up here, then an 8mm socket that'll go here to hold that, because sometimes those will spin. I'm going to be using this pass-through socket here, but essentially an open end wrench will do the same thing. I'm going to take that nut off, and sometimes these will pop out. Other times you need to give them a little bit of a whack here. Don't get carried away in here pressing on this, because you'll ruin that boot. then simply pull that out and put that to a side. The next thing we need to do is we either need to loosen up this ball joint down here that's holding the knuckle there, or a lot of times what I prefer to do is loosen up the two struts, because essentially what that's going to allow you to do is going to allow this whole knuckle here to move a little bit, so it gives you a little bit of leeway so you can get that joint pushed out of the hub here. So either way will work. I'm going to go the strut route here. Now keep in mind, anytime when you're moving some of these parts around, like loosen up these struts, you may or may not need an alignment, so just keep that in mind after you're done with the repair. Now one comment I'll make here real quick, anytime you're working on any of these suspension bolts, it's usually good practice to take a wire brush like this and just clean up those threads on the end, because a lot of times you'll have things get cross-threaded or they'll get stuck on there because it's corrosion. So I usually take a wire brush and a little bit of PE blaster before I take them off. Then simply take an 18 mil open end. You're going to have an 18 mil on this side as well. And simply remove those bolts. Alright, so after you get the bolts loosened, now you can see that we have some wiggle room here in order to get this out. So go ahead and take your nut off there. Now make sure your jack's down here to help support this. That'll help from creating an unnecessary bind over here, so make sure that's there. Then you're going to simply push the axle out there like that. Alright, so next we want to remove the axle from the transmission. I'm going to be using a slide hammer with an attachment on the end, and I'll show you the setup here in a second after I get this removed. But you can also use a screwdriver. You just have to be careful you're not damaging anything. But if you have room, usually these slide hammers are the easiest way to get these out. As you can see there, it just pops it right out. Then just simply pull the axle out of the transmission. Alright, so this is the setup here. This is the old one we just removed. This is the transmission side. So if you can see on our slide hammer, this is a front wheel axle attachment that we have on the end. Essentially what we did is we put this behind here, and we simply took our slide hammer and we hit it like that, then it pulled it out of the transmission. If you look here, all you're really doing is you're getting it past this clip. This clip is essentially what's helping it lock in there. So once you get enough pressure, it will eventually pop out. Then the next thing you want to do, just line it up with your old one and make sure you're putting it in the right way, and make sure that they are the correct size to verify that you did get the right part number. One thing I always tell people, I always get the GM or the factory part if I can. Now, granted, it's not always the cheapest, but you got to think, a lot of these parts are engineered for these vehicles. Yes, it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but the last thing you want to is go through all this work and have to redo it again because the thing failed here in 20,000 miles. So when you can, I would always get a factory replacement like we have here today. Alright, so now we're ready to go ahead and install our new one. GM does mention replacing some of the seals in here. I have replaced some, and I've also on times when I was not able to get a part in time, I didn't replace them. But it's usually always best practice to replace that seal back there. Then what you're going to do, you're just going to simply insert the axle in there. Now you're going to feel a little bit of resistance. You want to make sure you push it all the way in until you hear it kind of click in there. And the good way you can tell if it's all the way locked in there, you'll try to pull it back out and it won't come out. Now don't get carried away with pulling it like this where you're stressing these joints. You always want to pull it from the hard part in the back here one way or the other to make sure you're not going to stress these joints. And just like that, we just heard it click. And I can try to remove it and it will not pull out. So now we know it's all the way seated in there. Next we're going to go ahead and put this washer back on. Just make sure you're putting it on the right way. These clips are going to go inside the hub, so we'll go on like this. Then what I typically do is take a little bit of wheel bearing grease. Any wheel bearing grease will work. I don't get carried away with this, but I usually just put a little bit on the splines here. That'll help it kind of go in there easy. And it'll also help with corrosion down the road. Alright, so then after you get that, then we're going to position our hub, and eventually it'll come through there. If it's not going in right away, just make sure you're lining those splines up. Sometimes you got to rotate the hub a little bit in order to get them through there, but eventually you'll see that it'll pull through there. Alright, so next we're going to be installing the knuckle into the strut. Now these are torque yield bolts. We have some of these on order. They are not here yet, but what essentially that means is once you torque them the first time, they've stretched, so you don't want to reuse those. So it's very important to get these replaced. I'm going to go ahead and install these here just to show you the process, but when you're doing it, make sure you do also order the bolts and replace these. Initially, to get these lined up, sometimes it can be somewhat challenging, but you just kind of got to move it around. And once you get it positioned, sometimes it's easy to take a screwdriver in here and help kind of push it down in there where you need to go. So just kind of get it in there. Eventually, you'll kind of get it lined up where you need. And once you get one of them started, then the other one will be a lot easier to get in as well. And go ahead and thread the other one on. Then torque these bolts to 63 foot-pounds, and after you get that all the way tightened to 63 foot-pounds, you need to do an additional 60 degrees. Now if you don't have an angle meter, just do the best you can. So there we're at our 63, so now you're going to tighten it an additional 60 degrees. And just do that for both of those, then those are installed. So next we'll install the tie rod in, so just set it in there. And on this here, you're supposed to replace this nut. So again, ours are on order. They're not here yet, so I'll install this to show you. But this is going to go on 26 foot-pounds, then an additional 30-degree angle. Alright, so now we're ready to install the brakes. So you want to get your rotor lined up with this hole here that set screw goes to make sure it matches there. And simply tighten this screw down. Now don't get carried away with tightening these. This does not need to be very tight, because all this is doing is just allowing some pressure there to hold that in place. Now we're ready to put our caliper bracket back on. And then now we're ready to install the caliper. Now one thing to pay attention here, make sure you're not putting this in upside down or you have it folded back around where you're going to put a bind on it. Make sure it has enough leeway like it does here. And then go ahead and tighten those up. Alright, so now that we got the brake caliper back on there, don't forget to close the reservoir on your brake fluid under the engine. So we'll go ahead and close that. Then the last thing we need to do is just install our nut here on our axle. So the torque here is it's going to be, first tighten it to 111 foot-pounds, then we're going to back it off 45 degrees, then we're going to retorque it to 184 foot-pounds of torque. Alright, so after you get that torque to spec there, just double check all your bolts are tight. Put your wheel and your lug nuts on there, then you're all set. So hopefully this helped you out here today. If it did, please give me the thumbs up. If you're interested in more content like this, please hit that subscribe. But again, I hope this helped you out. Thanks for watching.